Okay, this presentation is going to focus on all of the assumptions underlying most of the scientific claims. And as I said in the first part one, there are two types of science: high confidence science and low confidence science. High confidence science is that which is observable, such as and testable. Boyle's gas law, Newton's law of gravity, microevolution, first law of thermodynamics, sunlight takes 8 minutes to reach Earth, Kepler's law of planetary motions. The low confidence is non-observable, non-repeatable, typically more of a historical narrative. That's the origin of the universe, origin of life, macroevolution or Darwinian evolution, age of the universe, distance of furthest star, and the geologic column. The high confidence is factual, the low confidence is faith-based. And as a reminder, Daniel Dennett, an atheist and secularist, said, "There's no such thing as philosophy-free science. There is only science whose philosophical baggage is taken on board without examination." So what he is saying is there's a lot of philosophical assumptions underlying many of the scientific claims that have not been examined. The four that I'm going to briefly go into is distant starlight, age of the universe, age of the earth, origin of life, and Darwinian evolution. And people should know the assumptions on both sides. Okay, what about distant starlight? That's billions of light years away, and we're going to be getting into the space-time continuum. First, understand that a light year is distance, not time, and a light year is approximately 6 trillion miles, the amount of distance that light travels in 1 year. Now, I want to show some of the assumptions being used, but keep in mind that during creation, God didn't have to use the laws of nature. They probably didn't begin until he was completely finished with his creation. Now, in 1927, George Lemaître, a Catholic priest and astronomer, proposed the universe was expanding. In the 1920s, Edwin Hubble confirmed that. And it wasn't until the 1990s that the consensus was the universe had a beginning and is still expanding. Prior to that, they thought it was eternal. The universe has always existed. Now, Space.com, quoting NASA, said, "Our expanding universe. Space did not exist before the universe. Space is not an empty void. It's an infinitely massless medium that can be bent." So when in Genesis 1, when it says, "In the beginning God created the heavens," he actually created, there wasn't an empty void, and that's a throwaway line. He actually created space, which is a medium that can be stretched and bent. And Space.com, quoting NASA, "It has been space that has been stretching and carrying matter with it." So to give you the concept of the expansion of the universe, it's the stretching of space between the galaxies, not the galaxies themselves traveling through space. So it looks like this as that matter is expanded. Now, Harvard Answers to Cosmic Questions says, "Space is a stretchable, flexible thing. Properties are still unknown, and as space stretches, it stretches time with it." An important component there. Now, this is an example of science teachers trying to explain space to students. And it creates a kind of a gravity well. And if that fabric represents the fabric of space, and if you have an object with mass in it, it's going to create a well and stretch that fabric of empty space, so to speak. Here's a gravity well, and typically if you throw objects around it, the objects move slower at the outer edge, and they'll eventually come into the middle, but that's due to friction. But in space, there is no friction. Okay, this is an example of something with mass stretching or bending space, and that would be an illustration of the orbit of the moon around the Earth. And we also have the sun makes a gravitational well, as do the planets. And all these gravity wells distort time. Here we see Mercury going around faster at 106,000 miles per hour around the sun. Earth is a little slower at 67,000 miles per hour. We get out to Jupiter, and it's slowing even further as the gravity well is not as deep. And then we have Pluto 10% of what Mercury is doing. Now, here's an example of the sun making a gravity well, a neutron star making one, and a black hole. And a black hole is a gravity well whose bottom, instead of being somewhat flat, is somewhat as a single point. Now, here's a gravitational well. It stretches time. And the closer you are to the gravity well, the slower time is. The further away, time is faster. And so it's if we were on Earth, for example, looking out, and if we could see the clocks in an object further away, we would see them spinning around. But if we were on that object further away from Earth, looking back at Earth, our clocks would seem normal, and the clocks on Earth would be going much slower. Now, our space station, for example, is only 220 miles from Earth, and it runs 35 microseconds faster each day. And the GPS satellite is even further, and it's 45 microseconds faster each day. But they have to adjust that daily, because without an adjustment, the GPS location would be off by 6 miles a day. That would be an incredible on our GPS navigation. Now, as an example of the time dilation, when time runs slower under the influence of a strong gravitational field, in the movie Interstellar, the crew went to a planet whose gravity was much stronger than what the space station that was orbiting around that was further away, in which a crewman was on board. And although they were on this area, this planet with strong gravity for 3 hours, the crewman who stayed behind aged 21 years whenever they returned. Now, Albert Einstein discovered that both speed and gravity distort time, but his secretary was bombarded with so many inquiries to explain it, he told her to reply with this quote: "When you sit with a pretty girl for 2 hours, it seems like a minute, but when you sit on a hot stove for a minute, it seems like 2 hours. That's relativity." Now, he knew in this example he gave, both clocks were running at the same speed, and it was relative. But his theory was based upon the opposite phenomenon. So given this background, here's the naturalistic assumptions, is that the Earth is not near the center of the universe. It's a meaningless speck. And the expansion of the universe and gravitational wells had little impact on time. The creation assumptions are the Earth and Milky Way are near the center of the universe, and the expansion of the universe and gravity wells had significant impact on time dilation. Well, is there any basis for the creationists to assume that the Earth is near the center of the universe? Well, now this cannot be proven, but the Bible indicates the Earth occupies a central position during creation. The distant galaxies are visible from all directions from the Earth. The galaxies are moving away from us in evenly spaced groups. And the cosmic background radiation, which is the furthest light in the universe, comes to us at uniformly from all directions. So the creation model is, with Earth near the center, the fabric of space began stretching outward. And the galaxy's distance from the Earth is increasing. And the days on the Earth would be millions of years in furthest galaxies, because time was stretched as well. Now, Dr. Russells, in his book 7 Years of Starlight Time, said, "The universe may have been 50 times smaller during creation, and the gravitational time dilation would have occurred. And the Genesis reference to time is based upon Earth clocks, not outer space clocks. And Creation.com lists 192 scientists with PhDs who believe in a young universe. Degrees in astrophysics, astronomy, nuclear physics, atmospheric physics. One, for example, became a believer at age 48 after believing in billions of years, and his PhD focused on distant galaxies 200 million light years away. Okay, let's look at some of the assumptions now underlying the age of the Earth. It's important to recognize that there is a strong motive in the secular world for the universe and the Earth to be old, because after all, if it's young, it's game over for origin of life and even evolution based upon natural process. Now, we hear statements like this: confirmed, which means proven. The oldest fragments of the Earth is 4.4 billion years. Now, hang with me on this one. It's based upon the fact that within rocks, there are certain elements, and some of them, like uranium, become unstable, and they eventually decay into lead. So here are the assumptions. This is known as radiometric dating. They have to assume that there was no lead in the rock when it formed, and all the lead, therefore, in the rock came from the decaying process of uranium. So there was no lead whatsoever in the rock whenever it was initially formed, and all of it came from the decaying process of uranium. A big assumption. Number two, for 4.4 billion years, nothing leaked into the rock. It was not contaminated in any way. The problems of these two assumptions were highlighted in a book on dating rocks and planets and stars by Henry Fall. He wrote, there's two important assumptions are implicit in this question. First, we're dealing with a closed system. Nothing leaked into the rocks. And second, that no atoms of the lead were present in the rock when it formed. These assumptions are the most serious limitations on the accumulation clock. Let us continue. They also assume that the decay rate was constant for 4.4 billion years. However, we read in other publications the strange case of solar flares and radioactive elements, and physicists found a faster decay rate in winter than summer due to the sun emitting radioactive particles. And these are neutrinos that fly through the earth and rocks and through your cells, and they come from the sun. Number four, the process of decaying was not affected by 5 catastrophic global extinction events, and also the fact that all the continents were at one time underwater. Now, Nicholas Steno is recognized as making the first great discoveries in geology, and in 1671 he published work that gave the world fundamental understanding of the different layers of rocks and sedimentation, with the older rocks are on the bottom. His work is published in textbooks and evolution websites. Yet in his publication, the dedication of his work is dedicated to the proof of the Noachian flood, or Noah's flood. And he believed the process of sedimentation occurred within the 12 months between the beginning of the flooding and when the earth was dry enough for Noah's family to leave the ark. He is known for the principle of lateral continuity. Layers of sediment extend outward into all directions until they terminate, which may be abrupt, for example, the end of a basin. And we see that in the Grand Canyon, for example. So he believed that what reshaped the earth was lots of water over a little time. However, about 100 to 150 years later, we have James Hutton and their theory of the earth, and Charles Lyell, who changed his process and said it was little water over lots of time. Now, we are told the Grand Canyon was formed over millions of years by the Little Colorado River. The idea it could have been formed by a catastrophic flood is out of the question. Why? Because that interpretation would resemble the account of Noah's flood in Genesis 7. But there have been canyons created in days by flood. In Discover, July and August of 2012, biblical type floods are real, and they're absolutely enormous. There is now compelling evidence for many gigantic ancient floods. These were not global deluges as described in Genesis, but were more focused, catastrophic floods taking place throughout the world. So what they're talking about really is a lot of local floods all over the world at the same time. In The Guardian, which is a British publication, English Channel was carved by huge ancient flood. And we found up in southeast Washington, the geologists believe that the floodwaters from Lake Missoula formed the canyon in days over 1,000 years ago. And in 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted, and even though this volcano destroyed 150 square miles of forest, it was rather small and localized compared to other recorded volcanoes. Nevertheless, this canyon was formed in one day. And notice the little river through it? Actually, the canyon came first and formed the river. The point is, if small local floods can create smaller canyons, a catastrophic flood could produce larger scale canyons such as the Grand Canyon. And in Astrobiology magazine, in the 2014 issue, scientists detect evidence of oceans worth of water in the Earth's mantle. And they found water 3 times our ocean found 400 miles down. So you see, there's enough water in the subterranean basin to reflood the entire Earth all over again. They also concluded that the deep layers of water may have been from materials that formed the Earth. Now, this is 180-degree opposite what the prevailing theory is, that Earth was a fiery ball, and after cooling, icy comets eventually, millions of years later, brought the water to form oceans. But the Bible has always gotten it right, and by God's word, the heavens came into being, and the earth was formed out of the water by the water. Okay, so that's kind of an overview of the age of the earth. The next topic is on the origin of life, and this is pretty exciting. And as a mega overview, what you have to appreciate is the origin of life is the origin of information. Because in order to have life, you have to have software, and it's the software that builds all of the structures, whether it be a blade of grass, a bacteria, multi-cell organism, or mankind. And in our computers, we have binary systems of 1 and 0. In all living things, it's a 4-digit code. Okay, let's talk about the assumptions behind the origin of life. And I think this is one that Christians really know, this and also evolution. Now, it's the number one reason people doubt the existence of God, and at the same time, the number one reason people believe in the existence of God. And the origin of life is really about the origin of information. And people do not have a clue how natural processes could even remotely produce information. And it doesn't matter how much time you have, even if you have 1 trillion of years, if the ability is not there. One way to approach it and kind of keep this in mind is ask questions. For example, what specific evidence supports the claim of a natural origin of life? You could use that question for specific evidence on origin of the universe or even Darwinian evolution. Another broad question would be, hey, if scientists cannot succeed in creating life in the laboratory, what evidence is there that life could create itself? And in these discussions, do not accept random chance as a cause. Random chance is not a generative force or causing anything. It's only a mathematical probability, so it doesn't act on anything. Here is a picture of Mars, similar to early Earth or day 3 during creation. It's an example of inorganic, non-living materials where there is no life whatsoever. So naturalists are assuming, given billions of years, this inorganic material could eventually create a man and a woman with consciousness. Well, let's talk about the properties of inorganic, non-living matter and what they are. Number one, they are simple. Salt, for example, one atom of sodium and one of chlorine. Sodium crystal is NaCl, NaCl, NaCl. Very simple. They do not contain a carbon atom. That's another characteristic. The examples of non-living or inorganic matter includes all metals, water. You can have water on Mars. That's not going to produce life. Air, ammonia, salt, minerals, gravel, sand, rocks, gases. You could have oxygen, hydrogen, chlorine. And non-living matter do not grow and they do not reproduce. What are examples and what's the difference of living matter or organic? Now you have to understand everything I'm going to list of organic or living things, none of this existed in the organic matter. And all of the things I'm listing are characteristics, and if one of them is missing, you don't have life. Number one, organic is extremely complex, molecules and assortment. Number two, they all contain a carbon atom. Number three, all of these must be present. Protein, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acid or your DNA, which is the source of information. Number four, they're all composed of cells. Number five, they are built by a blueprint of coded information. So the origin of life is also the origin of coded complex information. Number six, they have different levels of organization. They have tissues, they have organs, they have systems. Systems are basically organs working in irreducible complexity. Number seven, they're all goal-oriented and they have an end purpose. The goal is, for example, seeds grow into a 40-foot tree. The bacteria's goal is to collect enough nutrients to survive. Number eight, they all use energy and nutrition. Number nine, they excrete waste products through the cellular process. Number 10, they all have movement and sensitivity. Flowers open and close. You see them move towards the sun. Number 11, they grow. And number 12, they reproduce. Now, Dr. Flew, who was a former atheist, said the first emergence of living from non-living matter already possessed the capacity to reproduce itself genetically. No satisfactory naturalistic explanation of that. And in The Way of the Cell, Dr. Franklin Harold said the simplest living things, a single-cell organism, is a high-tech factory complete with artificial language and their decoding systems, memory banks for information storage and retrieval, elegant control systems regulating the automatic assembly of parts and components, error, fail-safe, and proofreading devices utilized for quality control. Now, when you have a proofreading device, you have to distinguish the original from the copy. And know which one is which. They have assembly processes involving the principle of prefabrication and modular construction, and a capacity not equal to any of our own most advanced machines, for it would be capable of replicating its entire structure within a matter of few hours. So all life is characterized by a complex code which has meaning to initiate and expected action for an intended purpose. Everything about life has the evidence of intelligence and beyond the capacity of natural process. And finally, former atheist Dr. Flew said in his book, There Is a God, do you think, given 1 trillion years, that this marble table that some point in history of the universe, the impossible happened, this organic matter became alive and then conscious, that this table could suddenly become aware of its surroundings, aware of its identity, the way that you are. It's inconceivable this could happen. And the same goes for any kind of matter. Once you understand the nature of matter, its mass, its energy, especially at the subatomic level, you realize by its very nature it could never become aware, never think, never say I. It is laughable. And finally, Dr. Walter Remy, in his book, The Biotic Message in 1993, now I got to tell you something about Dr. Remy. He was an evolutionist and became concerned when evolutionists remained quiet when so many false claims were being made. He's now a creationist, and his book shows the scientific evidence that natural world was designed to look like it did not evolve. Number two, it was designed to give evidence of one designer. And number three, designed to resist all other interpretations of origin. And our final topic is Darwinian evolution, which is an unsubstantiated theory which suggests that all life came from a universal common ancestor, and through a series of mistakes, it eventually made mankind. Now, Karl Popper, one of the greatest philosophers of science in the 20th century, stated that science must be falsifiable. And it's not scientific if we can show that it can be contradicted by an observation. In other words, proven false. And number two, not even being capable of being proven false by an observation. And evolutionists say, for example, that creation is not science because it's not falsifiable or testable. But in reality, it is the other way around. Let's apply the standard of being falsifiable to Darwinian evolution. Now, Dennis Noble at Oxford University has said in his book that all the essential assumptions of the modern synthesis, in other words, Darwinian evolution, have been disproved. And he's advocating coming up with a replacement, not an extension of the existing Darwinian theory. He's advocating a new theory, a new replacement. Here's one of the things we have to ask ourselves. The observations of living things. When you look at living things, does it look purposeful or messy? Do body parts look like proper fit and function, or do they seem cobbled together through a tinkering process? Now, you don't have to be an engineer to appreciate that life looks like design systems. You can't escape the fact that they reflect designs that bioengineers would envy because of their sophistication. And even the strongest atheists have said living things are not just complicated, they have the appearance, or they look as though they're beautifully designed machines. And biologists, according to Francis Crick, must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed but evolved. Now, why do they state this? Because the observation of evidence is breathtaking complexity in all living things. It isn't cobbled together or messy through random natural processes that typically produce disorder. They are beautifully designed machines, the hallmark or signature of a designer. But evolution predicted evolutionary leftovers. Evolution needs living things to be messy, not purposeful. And the messy things would be evolutionary leftovers from past generations of different kinds it is assumed that we evolved from. So as an example, here's what they predicted. Embryonic recapitulation through Ernest Haeckel. Now, Ernest Haeckel in 1866 suggested that embryos retrace their evolutionary history as they develop. In the column on the left is a fish, and then a calf and a rabbit, and a human is on the far right. And you see the similarity. what was incredible is just something like 8 years later, his drawings were proven fraudulent in 1874. In fact, here's his drawings on the left, on the top, and this is what they actually look like. Now, although many of the drawings don't appear, current drawings replace the same false claims. And this is in a biology textbook, and it's absolute false. In fact, one of the most prominent advocates of evolution in the 20th century, Stephen Jay Gould, a Harvard biologist, said, "We should not be surprised that Haeckel drawings entered the 19th century textbooks, around the 1800s. But we do have the right to be both astonished and ashamed by the century of mindless recycling that has led to the persistence of these drawings in a large number, if not a majority, of modern textbooks." In other words, they should have been removed 100 years ago, but they still persist to this day. Number 2, vestigial organs. Encyclopedia Britannica, about 40 years ago, stated that there are 100 vestigial organs in mankind. These are leftover, useless organs that are no longer necessary in a human, kind of evolutionary leftovers. The appendix, the tailbone, tonsils, pituitary gland, body hair, adenoids, all of this. In March of 2010, National Geographic said vestigial organs not so useless after all, study finds. In fact, a function has been found for all of these. The appendix, for example, is filled with good bacteria that resets the gut after dysentery. Transitional fossils. There should be, in fact, Darwin predicted that if my theory be true, there should be, more transitional fossils determined and discovered. Well, in 1980, they met together in Chicago, 160 of the world's top scientists. These aren't just scientists; they were paleontologists, people that are experts in geology and the fossil record. Science magazine in November covered that. Evolutionary theory under fire. The problem, according to most paleontologists, is the principal feature of individual species within the fossil record is stasis, not change. Stasis means stationary. Newsweek, who also covered it, said the more scientists have searched for the transitional forms between the species, the more they have been frustrated. And a UCLA paleontologist who attended was quoted as saying, "I take a dim view of the fossil record as a source of data." But the portrayal of the fossil record in a typical high school biology book is much different. The blue bar up above says the evidence for macroevolution is extensive. And it goes on to say the fossil record provides a clear record of continuous evolutionary change. This is a deliberate false conclusion. It's not only contradicted by the evidence, but it's also contradicted by a majority of secular paleontologists in the world. Junk DNA. Now, the observation in our bodies is that only 10% of the DNA is functional. And by functional, it builds and codes for proteins. The secular assumption is the remaining 90% of our DNA is useless. It's poorly constructed. It's an inefficient evolutionary leftover. Francis Crick said much of the DNA is little better than junk. They love the word junk. Richard Dawkins said, "What junk DNA are useful for is embarrassing creationists to make up a convincing reason why an intelligent designer should have created a pseudogene," which is another word for junk DNA. And Kenneth Miller, who's an author of many high school textbooks, said, "The human genome is littered with pseudogenes, gene fragments, orphan genes, junk DNA, and so many repeated copies of pointless DNA sequences that it cannot be attributed to anything that resembles intelligent design." Well, there was a 9-year project on the DNA called the Encode Project. You can look that up. 442 researchers from 5 countries. The U.S. cost alone was $185 million. And just 6 years ago, in September of 2016, they released their findings after this 9-year project. What they found was 80% of what was thought to be junk DNA is active. It has a purpose. That this non-coding DNA contains 4 million switches that turns genes on and off. And the switches work differently in various kinds of cells. And they also acknowledge they've only unlocked 10% of the secrets. Science said the Encode Project writes eulogy for junk DNA. And in circulation in 2014, they found that this junk DNA helps regulate the biological functioning, including keeping your heart beating. And then there was the progression of evolution observed in the geologic column over 600 million years. And the theory is, here's the geological column, and the theory was, hey, if you dig a hole, big hole, deep, you will find an orderly progression of fossils, with the most simple at the bottom and the more complex at the top. And this progression occurred over 500 million years, and the fossil record proves in the geological column evolution. And it's used to convince living animals got more complex over a time period of 600 million years. In other words, microevolution is true. And they're basically saying, based upon this, at one point on Earth, no mammals or reptiles, there were only invertebrates, worms, and sponges. And mankind appeared at the very end of this evolutionary process. Well, the truth is, the geologic column is an average of various rock layers from many locations all over the Earth. It's a mental abstraction of integrating all of the individual rock sequences into a single sequence. This is the Encyclopedia Britannica, a mental abstraction. The observation is the Earth's crust is not uniform, containing all strata. 77% of the Earth's surface area on land or undersea has 7 or more strata systems missing. That's around 60 to 70% missing. And in hundreds of locations, the strata is either inverted, repeated, or inserted where they do not belong. Because of all of these factors, Nature magazine asked this question, and these scientists were part of the group: does evolutionary theory need a rethink? Answer: yes, and urgently. Now, supernatural creation, I believe, can be falsified. Show the origin of life by natural process. Show one confirmed instance of purely physical or chemical elements producing complex information found in the genetic code. Or demonstrate evolution on a large scale. I mean, breeding labs have produced all kinds of animals. How about producing a cat or a zebra from a dog? And number 3, find solid transitional fossils that are indisputable. Now, what evolution is trying to assume is that natural processes have godlike creative abilities. So let's look at what are those mechanisms, and don't let them use the word chance. It's not a biological force. It's only the mathematical probability of anything occurring. Now, Darwin proposed natural selection. In many ways, natural selection is true. It's a natural process that eliminates existing animals. It does not create new ones. Animals that reproduce more have a better chance of survival. So it explains the survival of the fittest, not the arrival of the fittest. We need a process that doesn't just eliminate and make them go extinct. We need a process that causes change. So that was introduced in the early 1900s, and it's called genetic mutations. Now, genetic mutations are copying errors when the DNA makes a new strand before the cell divides. The observation is mutations are rare and they're destructive. And there's disease and there's birth disorders. And these mutations have to do more than just make a copying error. The DNA within a bacteria is about 2 books of 500 pages each. in a human, you're talking about over 1,000 books of 500 pages each. So this process of mistakes has to increase information that never existed in the ancestor. And let's ask ourselves, do beneficial mutations even occur? Well, Jerry Bergman, with his 7 advanced degrees and a PhD in biology and measurement, in 2004 did a study of beneficial mutations. And he researched literature published from more than 4,000 journals internationally. And he found research on over 170,000 mutations. Claimed to be beneficial, 98, or 0.5%. And all mutations resulted in loss of information. Now, the DNA of the fruit fly, Eric Weishaus, from a German microbiologist who in 1995 won the Nobel Prize, and I want to point this out. Here's what he found. New body plans have to be made by mutations in the embryo development. So if you're going to take something that's going to grow new body parts, it can't come when it's an adult later on in life. It has to occur in when the embryo is developing in order to produce those type of change that Darwinian evolution needs. However, he found if mutation occurs early in the embryo stage of life, the development shuts down and the fruit fly dies. So what we're talking about here is evolution really has no process. Mutations are mistakes. The DNA tries to correct many of those mistakes. If it happens in the later stages of life, there's no body plan changes that's necessary for evolution. And if it happens in the embryo, then the organism dies. So this process is a religious belief. And I'm going to conclude there. I appreciate you listening to the presentation. And on my website, proofforfaith.org, I go into a whole lot more of what the DNA has to do under the series, Your Life is Not an Accident. Thank you.